Cailin O'Connor, professor, UC Irvine. Welcome to the show. How are you doing on this fine day?
I am doing fine. Thanks.
This is cool. This is a wonderful thing. We are in place at the university that you profess at. What do you teach? What have you taught? What has been the trajectory to where you are today?
I'm in this department, Logic and Philosophy of Science. I do things at the intersection of philosophy and modeling stuff, especially in economics, biology. I teach a bunch of different classes. I teach a course called The Good Life, which is on like social health sciences and evolution of well-being. I teach another class on how cultural beliefs about things like gender and race influence science. I've taught on evolutionary game theory. I guess I had sort of an unusual trajectory here. So I didn't study any of those things in undergrad. I did an undergrad major in filmmaking, actually, but was always interested in the sciences and biology. And then later on ended up getting into philosophy of science, this like interdisciplinary area.
Did you use that filmmaking at some point?
I would say I use it all the time now, actually. So I think part of learning to make films is learning how to edit things out, like cut them down to the stuff you really need there and to let go of stuff you don't need, which turns out to be really useful writing. And I also think just the sort of learning more about aesthetics and setting up camera shots and things like that is useful for things like making slides and giving talks. You're better at creating a good look and a narrative to your talk and things like that.
I've looked up. You have many talks across many different locations and such.
Yeah, I give a lot of talks. I mean, I like giving talks, but also I'm a woman in a discipline with not a lot of women, and usually every conference and every series needs like some number of women. And so I ended up getting asked to give a lot of talks.
Cailin shows up.
Yeah.
That's cool. When you're doing speaking, was it always there, the ability from the beginning? Did it improve over time? Did you already have it? How much has it improved? And are you really good at it now?
You mean like public speaking? I think I probably had some natural tendencies towards, like I was always a person who liked performing in different ways, but obviously it's a talent that you have to develop. And I try to think of it as, like other skills in academia, I think of it as something that I'm like is an ongoing process of getting better at. And so I see what talks other people give that I think are good and copy things from them. And there are various things people have written over the years about how to give a good academic talk, how to make good slides, how to, set up a roadmap to guide your audience through. So I try to make use of things like that.
It's good to absorb from different locations. Like I can pick up on this and they have this method and speak louder at this part and then change like pace of voice.
Yeah, I think some things like that. I mean, in academia, like nobody ever talks about, for example, you're using your voice or using your body. But if you do something like theater, people would think, well, that's really important to, captivating an audience or getting an idea across. And so I think that all of these things can be tools for communicating in the same way that writing a good paper is a tool for communicating about academic ideas.
That's true. It's like if you're describing the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, it engages and then creates ATP. That's cool.
Yeah, I mean, sure. Yes.
It can be very presentational.
It can be very dramatic about the mitochondria.
Right. Wow. Adenosine triphosphate. That's cool. Now, one category I want to go into first is game theory. When you think of game theory, what are applications of game theory that come to mind involving people?
Yeah, well, so game theory was developed with people as the application. So initially, of course, it was developed inspired by theories of literal games like poker or chess, games that people would play with each other. And if you look at most models in game theory, you know, these are going to be models of strategic interaction. So you have to have multiple individuals interacting in ways where what the other ones do matter to everybody's outcome. And so there are just going to be endless applications in the human realm. I mean, bargaining games were developed to model bargaining and division of resource, which is something humans are doing pretty often. You have games like The Prisoner's Dilemma, which is a model of altruism, and altruism is very common in humans, and often people want explanations for why people are so altruistic, for example. You have models like The Stag Hunt is a model of risky cooperation. So this is something people do all the time, engage in cooperative projects where doing that will tend to benefit everyone if they can stick with it, but where there's always this risk because some people might drop out of the cooperative project or not do their part. Any student who's done a group project will know that that's the case. Signaling games model the transfer of information or communication, which is, of course, something people are doing just literally all the time. So there are a wide swath of games that apply to all sorts of interactions in the human realm.
When you have a sense of game theory, one time I talked with a professor about cooperation that fishes, they do, like there's a cleaner fish that cleans another fish, and then they have their own battle of sorts of like, oh, I need to clean a proper amount. If I don't, then they don't work with me the next time, and then I don't get food to eat off them or something like that. Knowing game theory, do you see that in life as you're going through existence? Do you see little elements of game theory in other categories?
Oh, you mean like when I'm walking around, am I like, oh, here's this game?
Or like a market, or like people, or an interaction, or a certain people trying to get into something?
Yeah, I guess I do. You know, there have been times where, well, so here's an example. Like, I've done a number of models using game theory to model scientific communities. So the way scientists would interact. For example, how would they divide the work of doing a paper and then divide the credit of doing a paper? So why am I developing a model of that? Well, it's related to my everyday experiences. And when I collaborate with people, it's clear to me that we have to make some decisions like that, and they're strategic decisions, who's going to do how much, who's going to be first author. And so I do think that it in some ways shapes the way I sort of observe day-to-day interactions.
I didn't think about that before, the first author and the various author ordering. Is that a thing that comes up in discussion, or how does that get worked out usually?
Yeah, so in some disciplines, you end up with these set norms of who's going to be what author. And so you don't have to have as many discussions about it. Like the principal investigator of a lab is going to be last author, and the grad student who does most of the work on the project is going to be first. But there's still plenty of places where if you do collaborative work, you're going to have an actual conversation about who is going to be in what author position and who deserves how much credit and what all of that is going to mean.
That's an interesting one right there.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know that goes on behind the scenes, but you'd have an idea based on it. It's got to be somehow assessed at some point.
Yeah.
True. Now, you said collaborations between scientists. Makes me think of, what are your thoughts on adversarial collaborations, where is the concept of having individuals that are writing a paper defend the other side as best they can, something like that?
Well, so, okay, I'm not an expert on adversarial collaborations, but I think that more often it's something like where you have people who have different opinions on some topic, and then they co-develop a test that maybe both labs are going to do. So it's not like one person does a test to prove it and one person doesn't. It's that they usually
have to kind of support each other's both. So there's not like we're just going towards this one viewpoint.
They have to come to consensus about what kind of test is going to be done to confirm or disconfirm the theory. I mean, generally, I don't know that much about it. As I said, it seems like a cool idea to me. I mean, I think in general, innovation in science and sort of the structures of science tends to be a good thing, because if you try many different things like adversarial collaboration, then you can find out, does it work? Does it improve the progress of science? So I'm for it, I guess, is my unreflective answer.
Okay, that's true. I like when it takes more effort mentally to look at the other side of a viewpoint and even try to speak for that.
Mm-hmm.
and then come back to your own, and maybe you have more understanding after that.
Yeah, and there's interesting things about trying to come to some sort of consensus from different viewpoints and how that process happens.
In the category of science, what are some of the key issues that still are difficult today to make good research come out? Valuable research that is accurate.
Oh, is this like what are the sort of challenges that prevent good research in science?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, there are a number. I mean, one of the big ones, and this of course is not my observation, but something that's all across the literature, has to do with the way incentives that scientists face can stand sometimes orthogonal to and sometimes in actual opposition to scientific progress. So people sometimes talk about scientists as responsive to credit incentives, if you've heard this phrase before. Yeah, so the idea being like, well, what do scientists benefit from at the end of the day? They benefit from getting attention, from getting engagement with their work, from people citing their work. These are the things that end up getting people fancy jobs, fancy, talks where they get a lot of attention, grad students who they like, all this sort of stuff. So if scientists are incentivized to get credit, getting credit is not always the same as discovering true things or doing extremely careful, good scientific work. So, for example,
more on the prestige side, right?
Yes. So seeking and getting prestige, it sometimes goes along with doing great work and sometimes it doesn't. So, of course, if you discover some fantastic thing in science, you're probably going to get a lot of credit and prestige for it. On the other hand, this credit incentive pushes people to try to publish a lot. And sometimes that means doing things quickly or in a sloppy way. The credit incentive pushes people to find positive findings because those are the sorts of things you can publish in journals. And what that means is that often people are incentivized to use methods that will yield positive findings, whether or not those positive findings are correct or useful. So if you look at the replication crisis, one analysis of why it happened is there were a bunch of research practices being used in different fields because they tended to generate positive findings, whether or not those were accurate findings. And scientists want to use them because then they get credit for those findings.
That's true. Yeah, if you have research that's out there but is not the best and then it continues to be used repeatedly, how do you clear that out in some way at some point?
Yeah, this is something that I've thought some about and my group has thought some about. And especially we've thought about what we call failures of retraction, where if we think generally about what a retraction is, it's a reversal of some position in science. So we said this was a real finding. We thought this thing was true. Now we either find that it wasn't supported in the way it was, or now we think it's false. So we want everyone to change their opinion. There can be challenges with that. The first is just sort of a simple, how do you communicate with people sort of challenge. So a positive finding has worked its way out through a social network. A lot of people have heard about it. Are the same people going to hear about a retraction of that finding? Not necessarily. They might just miss it. Another issue goes back to incentives in science, where if you're a scientist and you have some positive finding getting you attention and you have to retract it, you don't necessarily have an incentive to, let everyone know about the retraction.
I'm canceling my great success.
Yes, ignore all the great things that I've shown before. They were all wrong. There's less incentive to get people to think that you did poor research or you were wrong than that you had an initial public finding. Another issue has to do with where retractions come from. So in some of my modeling work with some co-authors, one thing we found is that if you think of retractions as something that spreads in a social network, they're going to be most effective if they come from the same source as an initial false claim. So if I have a finding and it's wrong and people are learning about it sort of through my social network, and then I start spreading a retraction in the same place, it's going to tend to hit the same people. But if someone who is not connected to me is trying to spread a retraction, it's not going to be hitting the same people. And what you often see is people refuting others who aren't socially connected to them.
A few points come to mind from that one. One of them, I always have this analogy, like on a freeway. If somebody passes you, if you went to go past them, I know it's an odd analogy, but it would take so long before you pass them and you have to use a bunch of gas and go around a bunch of cars. You don't end up getting the person, passing the person who passed you first. It's so much effort. So it's kind of like that same thing with papers. Like by the time you would have retracted it, the person's already long gone, or that idea is already long spread. So there is that difficulty of capturing the thing once it's already.
Yeah, I think that there's something to that. So the way I think about it, sorry, like holding this, I'm such a gesture. I'm like, it's making me stay still. The way I think about it is something like, if you think about an idea spreading in a social network, say here's where the idea is spreading. If someone retracts it over here, it hasn't changed anything about this. Right? These people are still doing the same old thing they're doing unless you can somehow get them information about that retraction, but you may not be able to. So there's something about like you can let an idea out in science and then totally lose control of it, because in the places in our social networks where it's spreading, the people who originated that idea don't have control over that spread.
On the concept of the networks that are involved, how much of a finding or a topic is based on the network that's come from, and that it can be built on from that network, or is it not that relevant, the group that originated something? How much of science is based on network? Like recently I was hearing about the dollar, and the dollar is more of a network than a currency, because to replace the dollar, you'd have to replace the whole network of systems that's in place with the dollar before you would replace it. You'd have to replace it with something else. Same thing with like the internet and the networks that exist. It's already a bunch of different companies and whatnot. What about in like science?
Okay, so thinking of a dollar as a network, this is like not my research area. I will not commit to that being the best understanding of the dollar. But the types of social locations of scientists and their interactions with other scientists very, very much shape the kind of research that scientists do. This has been well known for a long time. So, for example, Thomas Kuhn is one of the first most influential philosophers of science, and he pointed out that a lot of times what you see in science is an important idea gets entrenched. There are a number of older scientists, often people with connections to each other, working on this idea, supporting it. And then often the first people trying to overturn ideas are younger people and newcomers to a community, those with fewer social connections to the original bunch, if you will. And there are all sorts of reasons that might happen. I mean, scientists are humans. They care what other people think about them. They have friends. They're more influenced by their friends than they are by other people. So you have all these social things. It's also just the information you have and the things you believe about the world are also shaped deeply by the people you're connected to. So if someone knows X, the people with social connections to them are more likely to know X, or to be thinking about X, or to be working on X. And so you also see these effects in science where a whole group of people maybe in the same location or who are all friends will start working on similar projects. And that could be just because someone starts working on it and then other people hear about it and then they get interested in it. And so their social locations are then shaping what they're doing and what they're working on. And at the same time, it could be that this person was their friend. They have social connections. They want to conform with them. They don't want to offend them. And so there can also be these, what we might think of social interactional effects shaping what things people end up working on.
One thing you mentioned there, is it like a startup effect? Like if there's a couple of scientists and there's already an entrenched group of scientists, but new ones show up and maybe bring out ideas that are not as common, or something that shakes up what's happening. Is it more likely to come from newcomers than from those who are already doing science?
A lot of people have drawn on the history of science to argue that that is the case, that you often see new ideas coming from newcomers and younger people. So For example, one of my colleagues, Kyle Stanford, has argued that the fact that people tend to be older when they become heads of their own labs now, so the average age of PIs is going up, might mean that you're going to see more conservatism in science, because by the time people are really shaping ideas, they're already indoctrinated into an area of science.
That's true. That makes sense. When a certain field gets to an age group and that's the people running the item, they're going to think of it a certain way based on where their mindset is at, and then that might lead to a little bit less flexibility or more rigidity of a certain way to do things.
Yeah.
That's true. Oh, what is when it comes to like principal investigators or people running labs, is there any personality traits that are common among them that you have noticed?
I don't know. I mean, I guess like, I don't really know that. I'm sure somebody's researching that, but I don't know that much about it. I mean, I think there are things about the kind of people who want to go into academia in general. Like, they're obviously people who like to sit and work on topics for a long time, who are into the life of the mind. Like, there are certain specialties of personality like that. Looking at people who head labs, there is still a huge amount of diversity in the types of personalities you see doing that.
That's a good sign. I always look at personality a lot, like Big Five and the various types and how that relates to people in their category of what they do. It's always been informative to me. Now, switching to the category of philosophy. Now, philosophy of science versus philosophy, do you look as much into free will and determinism and topics of popular philosophy, or what does philosophy of science look like separately from that?
Well, there's a lot of topics in philosophy of science. I would say that some of the things you see, there's a lot of things that are looking at how science works one way or another, where science is the topic that you're studying. Natural connections to philosophy come in that, a central area of philosophy, epistemology, is concerned with knowledge and the production of knowledge and how people come to know things. Science is one of the most important ways that people come to know things in our culture, and so understanding it is important from a philosophical point of view. So a lot of people do those kinds of things. How does science work writ broadly? And then there are a lot of philosophers of science who do things that are connected to the theoretical sciences, where, maybe they're working on physics, but they work a little more in the mathematical foundations than most physicists would, or they work more on the conceptual foundations of physics, or they answer questions that are a little more philosophical about how, things like, how could we ever know about something that's very far away, or where we only get third-hand data? Or people working in biology might do things that are a little more about foundational evolutionary theories than most biologists would work on now. Or people working on cognitive science might think about things like free will more than most cognitive scientists would. So that would, I would say, are sort of the two main types of philosophy of science done. And then within that, there's just a huge diversity of what topics that people are working on.
You mentioned epistemology. It made me think of Peter Boghossian. He does street epistemology. Have you heard of Peter Boghossian, where he goes on the street and he asks?
Yeah, but I don't know about the street epistemology. What does he do?
He ask students a question and then have their viewpoint, and then have lines on the ground like strongly agree, somewhat agree, disagree, and then have them stand where they feel they are.
Okay.
And then have each one to bring up viewpoints, and then ask them if they would adjust their viewpoint. So it's like to check if each person would adjust their viewpoint in some way based on new information, or if they were just stuck at a certain point of disagreeing with something or agreeing with something. So it's like getting critical thinking in place, which also makes me want to check how do we get more critical thinking in place across the board? Question of the year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really like an expert on critical thinking. Certainly, I know lots of people have big projects on critical thinking, especially in the wake of, crises with misinformation and disinformation, especially in the last probably 7 or 8 years. For example, at University of Washington, they have the Calling Bullshit project, where part of what they're trying to do is give people tools to improve data literacy. And then I think there are a lot of things out there like that, but I'm not really an expert to know the details of the best way to improve critical reasoning.
I always think about the ability to cause others to think or bring that thought in place. Mm-hmm. One thing that came to mind based on what you just said, misinformation is only going to become more prevalent, it appears, based on the tools we have right now. How does one counter misinformation right now, whether it's text or visually or in soon video form?
Yeah.
What are the ways to assess that or counter that today?
Yeah, so the things that I tend to focus most on in thinking about misinformation and countering misinformation are larger structural features where changes in these features can make a big difference to the lives of many, many people and the informational environments of many, many people. So one enormous problem in the US, for example, is partisan media and the impacts of overly partisan media. So we know that some media sources like Fox News, they spread quite a lot of misinformation, even though they're standard mainstream media sources. There are a whole handful of sources on the left and the right that are highly polarizing. So previously in the US, we've had regulations like, say, the fairness doctrine, where if you want to present controversial issues, you have to present both sides in an approximately balanced or fair manner. So there are structural changes that could reduce the impacts of partisan media. I think that's important. If we're looking at online misinformation and disinformation, I think we need to be thinking about platforms and regulations for platforms. So what kind of structures in the government can best work with platforms to get them to reduce the amount and the impacts of misinformation and disinformation? I tend to think something like a flexible regulatory body, like an analogous thing to the EPA or the FCC that's just working with social media platforms is something we should have.
Like a checkpoint of some sort.
Well, like something that sets certain standards, say, for the prevalence and impact of misinformation on a platform, and then works with companies in flexible and ever-adapting ways to help them comply with those standards.
For the partisan media, is their value as media reduced? Is that the way to do it? Or is it to get them to bring forth a fair and clear viewpoint? Do you speak directly to the partisan media to make a change, or is it something from outside affecting how people see them in the first place?
I guess I'm not totally sure. I tend to think that we should have certain regulations on media involving things like fairness over controversial issues, and also regulating the amount of false information that is conveyed via these large, standard, widely trusted news sources. So I guess the answer to that is probably that we're looking at changes to the news sources themselves via legislation.
Sounds like a good way to do it from that end right there.
Yeah. Well, if you think about like how we deal with threats to public health in general, usually when there are threats to public health, but companies are not incentivized to prevent those threats. In fact, those threats are somehow going along with the incentives of the company, usually the only solution is for the government to step in, because we know that companies don't regulate themselves. And so if we look at highly partisan media, the incentive structure is one where these companies are getting attention and viewership by being divisive, often by spreading misinformation, often by sharing views that are highly partisan and one-sided. And so their incentive structure does not line up with public interest. And in situations like that, we think of it as the kind of situation where, we expect these companies to keep doing things that are harmful to the public. And so who stands for the interest of the public? Well, policy, government.
That's true. On the incentive structure concept, made me think of, is there any way to alter the incentives for scientists that are already in place?
Yeah, some of the big conversations, for example, in the meta-science movement, are around how you could incentivize scientists to do different science. And some of the answers that people have come up with have to do basically with putting what we think of as safeguards and regulations in place, and these shift the kind of structures that scientists are working in. So, for example, there's a big movement to pre-register studies where scientists need to say ahead of time what they're going to do in a study, and then do that same study. And then if what they did is different, they have to explain why it was different. This is something that does change incentives in science. So before the pre-registration movement, your incentive might be to shift the story you tell about the data you get. So maybe your data didn't support your initial finding, but it supported something else. You retell the story of, we had this hypothesis, our data supported it, now we're publishing on that. Now we get to do a big paper showing that we were smart and we found this positive thing. If you need to pre-register studies in order to publish, there is now no longer an ability to tell these kinds of post hoc stories that are incorrect and can be misleading.
That's a nice way to prevent that. It's good to have systems in place like that. That's true. The more you look at something from a meta view, what about that concept? The idea that the more you look at something from a meta view, the more clearly you can see it. You can never see something clearly from the same level of it. It's always best to look from one level above. Any thoughts on that?
I don't know. That's like deep. It's very high level. You're gonna have to get someone above my pay grade to answer that one.
Just thought I'd throw that in there. I like looking at like different layers of thought. That's a fair one. Now, when it comes to philosophical investigation, what kinds of things are you looking at recently that are important to you?
Yeah, so one of my biggest recent projects has been on, what you might think of as group or social epistemology. So how do groups of people come to know things? How do they spread information? How do they develop consensus? And especially the failure modes of groups. So what things might lead groups to do worse in a process of coming to develop knowledge. So that's something that I've now been working on for quite a while. More recently, I've been working on a project related to this class I mentioned earlier, where I'm writing a book about how social beliefs, especially related to personal identity, tend to impact science. So this is a topic a lot of people have written on, but what I've been working on is something that takes a lot of important insights that have been developed in philosophy of science, but are sometimes written up in more difficult ways, so that might not be easy for members of the public or undergrad students to read. So taking some of those insights and moving them into a format that's more teachable, more readable, about the ways that our background beliefs seep into the stages of scientific practice.
One thing about the group item you mentioned, have you seen that where it's like if there's a group, when 25% of them support something, then it starts to take over, but until then it doesn't reach the masses? Have you looked into anything like that where it takes a certain percentage of a group agreeing with something before it starts to really become popularly accepted?
Yeah, I think there's a number of, I don't know if I know this exact study you're talking about, but I think there's a number of related phenomena, having to do with effects like conformity, where people tend to have a desire to match the beliefs and the behaviors of those in groups they're in. And so sometimes when something becomes more prevalent, it sort of has a greater strength of conformity, if that makes sense. It makes people want to conform more and more the more prevalent something becomes. I think there are related phenomena like information cascades, where when people start to hear the same thing from multiple people, they might come to have a stronger and stronger belief in that, whether or not those people were actually influencing each other in the first place, whether or not they know if those people were independent. So I think there is quite a lot of stuff related to this sort of idea that ideas becoming prevalent in a group tend to become more prevalent for various reasons.
That's an interesting one. That one. That's kind of cool to look at. The other item you mentioned is how can science be made easier to grasp for individuals that are not as advanced? Is there enough of that? How do you do more of that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, for example, science journalism or people doing popular science, people devote their lives to thinking about this question, like, how do you do it well? Because it really can be tricky and complicated. Often findings in science and their support are very complicated. It's often pretty nuanced. To what degree is some claim supported and by what evidence? How do different theories relate to each other? What are the various reasons theories have become popular or not become popular? All of this is nuanced and hard, and at the same time, you want to be able to communicate about science in a way where people can understand it. And so there's like a necessary tension there, as many people have pointed out, between the kind of simplicity that is needed for communication, especially with non-experts. I mean, I probably don't need to tell you that in many areas of the science, to understand them, you have to be a major expert to develop years of your life towards that kind of expertise. So how do you make things simple enough that you can communicate them, and at the same time not let go of all this complexity that might really be needed to understand an area? And I think the answer is there's not always a great way to do it. You just got to do the best that you can. What I try to do quite often is use techniques that grab interest and sort of pull it in long enough to introduce more complicated or difficult ideas, like storytelling techniques. Humans in general really like narration and storytelling, and so that can be one way to sort of take people into complicated scientific ideas and draw out nuances in them.
The storytelling concept is a very important one. I've talked about it a few times, how much it has an impact. Why is it so compelling to people that something is brought up in the form of a story?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think you have to go talk to some psychologist about that one. I don't know why people like stories so much.
I've noticed it's very relevant. And Kobe Bryant was talking about how important storytelling was to him when he was writing some of those. So it's definitely like memorable, because then these details happen. It connects with like the human condition, and I tried to do that, and then this, and then you can follow it along, versus if it's just facts, it's harder to connect with directly in that way.
Yeah.
Are there any key figures that have been guided you along or provided like a fork in the road of your path?
I mean, there have been so many people who have like impacted where I ended up now. Probably the biggest fork is my husband and collaborator, Jim Weatherall. So I had never heard of philosophy of science until we started dating. And at that time, I was like doing production assistant work on random films and like waiting tables and thinking about maybe I'll go to grad school. I was like doing children's theater, just random stuff. And then just the sort of by chance that we started dating and I started learning about the area he was in. And I thought, well, this is really quite interesting. And ended up going into that. And so obviously that was like kind of unexpected path that ended me up here. And then there are things like I initially thought, well, I'll do philosophy of science and I'll work on things related to neuroscience and maybe the neuroscience of aesthetic preferences, because I had been doing this previous stuff on film and media. And then, I got to grad school and my advisor, Brian Skirms, was doing stuff on evolutionary game theory. And I just thought, well, that's cool. I'll just do that instead. So then just followed off that way. Or, one of my colleagues, Simon Hudiger, just had a set of game theory notes I was teaching from where he presented the formalism in this particular way where you have two different populations of individuals interacting rather than one population. And it was meant as a teaching tool. And that kind of got me onto these two population models. And I ended up writing a whole book that's just only two population models. So I don't know. I guess maybe this story like gives you a picture of how random like science or academia is and the things people end up working on, how influenced it is by the people around you.
That's a wonderful point. It's like little key points and then that way, and it's very people oriented where people is at the base. That's very interesting. And then you're both professors here, you and Jim.
Yeah.
How has that been? That's a very interesting concept. I don't know if that's that common. That's super interesting.
I think there's quite...
Is there any overlap of your also material as well?
Yeah, we do collaborate together. We've written a number of papers and a book together. I don't think it's so unusual for partners to be in the same department. I think that if you looked at all the possible jobs and people married and you were like, what's the probability that they'd end up in any two jobs, that like you'd see sort of an unexpected number of academic partners. Because people meet in grad school where they're working on the same things, or they meet in their department, or they get together and then their interests are pulled together, like Jim and I. I generally think it's very nice. I mean, there's some weirdnesses of going to work with your husband. It's like you're at home and you're at work, and like you're just always here, But mostly, I think it works out pretty well. Collaborating together is convenient because you can just shout into the next room about whatever idea you want to talk about, instead of having to do a whole let's set up a meeting.
There's a lot of efficiency right there. That's true.
There's some efficiency.
Right. That's super cool. I'm always curious of pairing as well. Like, is there like a mutual challenging of sorts, or like is there some elements that one does and the other, like a strength from one and then fills in a weakness for the other kind of thing?
Oh yeah, that's interesting. I think so. I mean, for example, I cannot come up with a good title to save my life, and Jim is absolutely the best at titling everything. Okay, that's like a facetious example. But I think there's a lot of, like the intimacy of a relationship means that you can really argue stuff out and really say what you think. And I think that does, in some ways, allow for debate that changes both of our minds and probably makes both of us what am I trying to say? Probably improves our reasoning about various topics, like having someone to just argue it out with, talk it through with. Often, discussion is a very good way for ideas to sort of like a little bud to flower out as you talk with someone else. And so there's benefits to having someone around who you can do that with all the time, I think.
That's a very strong point. There's a category of my hefty interest because I'm always looking at people and such, and it says a lot of good what you just described, that you can have difficult conversations because that means there's already a strong base, and then from that, with these difficult conversations, I think Jordan Peterson said if you're able to have them, then you can weather anything. But if you're avoiding the difficult conversations, then issues can come up. So that's nice to have that ability, and then when you have that, you're able to tackle the things with somebody else, because some of us are very like, I don't get ideas usually if I'm just by myself, for example. But if I'm talking with somebody, I'll come up with things I wouldn't have come up with at all for hours. So that sounds highly beneficial, the way you described that. And you probably noticed that early on in your pairing.
Yeah, I mean, the further back you go, the more we started with really different ideas about how things worked. And so, like, early on, we probably just, like, had more intense arguments about ideas. And then over time, they, like, tamped down to less intense arguments about ideas.
Even that, I see some good value in that concept, because you're able to hit the difficult early on, and then it smooths out because you did that. But if you left that alone, I think it can only go one way or the other. It can only lessen or increase, if I had to guess. That's my idea.
Or it could stay the same. That's the other option. It could increase, it could lessen, or stay the same.
Does that counter the idea that either you are stagnating or you are growing, and the middle is almost impossible? It's like a...
what kind of growth are we talking about? Like intellectual growth? Because if physical growth, like, you know, definitely up, down, or the same.
Right. There's that. This one was more like, this was life growth. Like, you're either, let's say like a business, it's either stagnating and it's being outcompeted, or it's growing and you're getting the compound effects or compound interest type of thing. I think there's something to that. I think it's actually quite hard to be like this for a long time in any business or relationship or anything, because if there were things really accumulating, you'd start to really ramp up and maybe hire somebody else or something, and this would go up, and then, or else things are diminishing, and then, like, I've always thought of life as kind of like a hill. Like, you're either on this side and like paying interest on the loan that you already had and paying this fee and paying this thing, or it's like I'm getting extra and I'm investing in stocks, and it's like kind of one side or the other. I have a lot of things visually I think of in that way. That's an interesting one. What is a topic of concern that comes to mind when you think of this kind of a broader question, the next like until 2030, that's like an issue for society or in your research?
I mean, I guess I tend to think a lot of the issues that I would be most worried about are ongoing ones, like climate change. I mean, I think misinformation is also an ongoing, ever prevalent, ever evolving, ever changing issue. It's tricky because as new platforms start, there are new kinds of information exchange and new kinds of misinformation on those new platforms. It's also tricky because as people learn and adapt to different kinds of information, then there are incentives for people who create it to change it, so that whatever you've learned about it becomes obsolete or not relevant to whatever the newest thing is. And so I do think of that as an issue that creates serious threats to democracy and public health.
On the climate issue, I really should cover more issues that are, they're tense, is you see the Atlantic Ocean slightly getting like new highs these last few years. Does humanity feel what's happening? Is there like a feel of all our fellow people that there's a heating up going on, and it makes people a bit more nervous or worried that may be underlying a lot of other discussions? Is there something to that?
I don't know.
No.
I mean, I certainly get the sense that maybe increasingly people are worried about climate change, but it's hard for me, like, I don't do research on that, and so it's hard for me to know whether that's just anecdotal or whether there's something, or how this is changing.
Fair. My last question for you is, are there any books or people you would recommend that their viewpoints are something that you think are great, or a book that you think has been very good for you?
Man, there's a lot of...
Just one out of all of everything that's ever existed.
Oh boy, okay. I'm definitely having recency bias here. I'm now thinking about like all the books I just read. Like I've just been reading all this stuff about gender influence in science. I'm like, oh, these books are great. I can't pull out just one. That's just silly.
I'll switch it to this one here because you mentioned
Okay.
bias. What are some of the most common biases people have that you have seen from your field of research that affect things?
So if I were, I mean, probably the field of my research we've been talking about the most has to do with beliefs, misinformation, with failures of belief. The biases there that tend to matter the most are these sort of social interactional ones, things like the desire to conform, biases related to who people trust. They tend to trust people who are more like them and who share their beliefs, for example. And then some biases related to how people reason about information, like confirmation bias, where they reject things that to them seem unlikely or like they don't already fit in with their beliefs.
Those are some popular ones. I've seen this one bias. Have you seen this one circular bias picture that has all the human biases and there's like 150 of them or something?
Oh boy. Yeah, I think people sometimes compellingly argue that like they're going back to incentives in science. There's a lot of incentive as a psychologist to coin your own bias, but sometimes various ones are best thought of as under an umbrella of a related umbrella. So of those 150, maybe some of them are not totally really distinct from each other.
Right. Yeah, they put them in like groups to make it nice with colors and such. But
oh, okay.
The colors make it great.
Yeah.
That's funny. Where might people locate your material? What would you direct them towards to see your content? What would you share there?
Yeah, so I have a website, which is just my name, CailinO'Connor.com. All of my academic papers are up there. The descriptions of my books are up there. My trade book, The Misinformation Age, is like the most widely read thing that I've published and is a crowd pleaser, apparently. Though my academic monograph, which is called The Origins of Unfairness, I think is better. And people can also find me on Twitter at Cailin Meister, though I've recently been doing some social media cleansing and not been spending as much time on there, but I do go on sometimes.
Glad for that one. I have to add this one in because you mentioned that it's an important topic. Minimalism, cleansing, being able to get into a focused state of work. Any tips in that category?
Oh yeah, get off social media. It really helps. Yeah. But it's hard because I'm addicted to it.
The companies have been successful in their...
They have. They're just too good. I was like the 1,000 something user of Facebook. So in my defense, I've been indoctrinated for a long time.
That's pretty interesting right there.
Yeah.
Who can say that? That's very uncommon.
Yeah, actually the first Facebook, I emailed, what's his name? Mark
Zuckerberg?
Yeah, Zuckerberg. I emailed him and was like, you put me in as Cailin O'Connor. Could you change it? And he was like, yeah, I'll change it.
That's getting in at the ground floor right there.
Yeah. Before it was a thing.
That's a classic one right there. Wonderful. Professor Cailin O'Connor, I'd like to thank you for having joined on this episode and brought a lot of knowledge to us about philosophy and your various research.
Well, very nice talking to you.
And we are out.